The scent of expensive white lilies always reminded Elena of her mother's cruelty, a floral mask designed to cover the lingering decay of a family built on beautiful gilded lies. It was New Year's Eve in Chicago, and the grand ballroom of the Blackstone Hotel was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp tuxedos, a place where the city's elite gathered to toast to their own perceived greatness. Elena sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns of the lace tablecloth, feeling like a ghost haunting a feast that was never meant for her. Her mother, Beatrice, was the undisputed queen of this domain, a woman whose every movement was choreographed for the cameras of the Social Gazette. Across the table sat her brother Julian, 34 years old, and radiating an aura of unearned arrogance that felt as heavy as the crystal chandeliers above them. Her father Arthur was holding court at the head of the table, his voice a deep, rhythmic rumble as he discussed private equity and the shifting tides of the global market. To any outsider, they were the portrait of American success, a legacy family whose name opened doors and silenced critics. To Elena, they were the architects of a silent, suffocating prison. The first course had barely been cleared when Beatrice leaned in, her smile as sharp and cold as the winter wind howling against the hotel's tall windows. The diamonds at her throat caught the light, casting dancing reflections across Elena's face, as her mother whispered with a terrifying honeyed sweetness that only she could master. "We truly only invited you tonight out of a sense of profound pity, Elena, so please try to stay in the background and not embarrass your father with your usual lack of social grace." The words hit Elena with the force of a physical blow, yet she remained motionless, her expression a mask of practiced indifference. Beside her, Julian let out a jagged, mocking laugh that cut through the polite murmur of the surrounding guests. "Honestly," he said, raising his champagne glass so that the light illuminated his smug expression, "Elena is essentially the family's permanent charity case, the one who never quite understood the rules of the game. We have to hide her away just to keep the family brand from tarnishing." A few distant cousins at the table chuckled a sound of collective cruelty that made the air in the ballroom feel thin and freezing. They had spent years using her as the punchline to their jokes, the foil to their brilliance, and the invisible safety net for their secret failures. As the night wore on, the insults grew bolder, disguised as playful banter, but carrying the weight of decades of resentment. Elena really watched them for the first time in her 32 years. She saw the way Julian's hands shook slightly when he checked his phone, a sign of the financial stress he was desperately hiding from their father. She saw the way Beatrice looked at Arthur with a mixture of fear and calculation, knowing her lifestyle depended entirely on his favor. And most of all, she saw the way they looked at her as if she were a piece of furniture that had long outlived its usefulness. A strange, icy stillness settled over her heart, a realization that the bonds of blood had been severed long ago by their own hands. She didn't argue, she didn't weep, and she didn't offer a single word of defense. When the clock struck midnight and the room erupted in cheers and the clinking of glasses, Elena stood up with a quiet, terrifying dignity. She informed them she had a pressing engagement early the next morning and walked out of the ballroom, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor as their laughter followed her like a shadow. The Chicago night was brutal, the wind whipping off Lake Michigan and cutting through her thin coat, but Elena felt a warmth spreading through her chest that she hadn't felt in years. She returned to her modest studio apartment in Wicker Park, a space filled with the sketches of the game environments she designed in the quiet hours of the night, and sat at her weathered desk. Her hands were no longer shaking. She pulled a worn leather folder from the back of a locked drawer, a collection of documents she had signed over the years with a naive sense of duty. Her father had always told her it was for the family, for the legacy, for a future she was too young to understand. That night, under the harsh light of a single desk lamp, she finally read the fine print. She read until the sun began to peek over the grey horizon, and what she discovered was a betrayal so deep it left her breathless. The sprawling mountain estate in Aspen, the place they called their sanctuary and featured in every glossy magazine spread, was not held in a family trust. It was hers. It had been left to her explicitly by her grandmother, a woman who had seen the greed in Arthur's eyes long before Elena was even born. Her parents had been using the property as collateral for a revolving door of high-interest loans to fund their extravagant lifestyle and Julian's disastrous business ventures. But it didn't stop there. She found credit lines she never authorized joint accounts, where she was listed as the primary holder, while her mother drained the funds for couture and jewelry and a series of tax shelters that tied her name to Arthur's most questionable investment. They had spent years painting her as a failure, while simultaneously using her identity as the backbone of their financial empire. They had invited her to dinner to mock her, while they were effectively living off her inheritance. The irony was a bitter pill, but as she stared at the documents, she realized she held the power to dismantle it all with a single phone call. She thought of Sarah, her closest friend from her university days, a woman who had climbed the ranks of the city's most prestigious law firms and who understood the intricacies of estate fraud better than anyone. As the first day of the new year dawned, Elena sent a short coded message to Sarah, and then she began the process of taking back her life. 1 week later, the silence of Elena's apartment was shattered by the frantic, rhythmic vibration of her phone. She was sitting on her small sofa, a cup of lukewarm tea in her hand, watching the rain slide down the window panes. The first call was from Beatrice, followed by a second, and then a third. She let them all go to voicemail, listening, as the notifications for her email began to pile up like snow. The subject lines were a symphony of panic, urgent account status change, notice of foreclosure, and immediate legal inquiry. When Julian finally called for the 5th time, Elena answered, her voice as calm and flat as a frozen lake. The voice on the other end was unrecognizable, a jagged mess of fury and desperation that made her smile for the first time in years. "Elena, what have you done?" Julian screamed, his breath hitching as he spoke. "Do you have any idea what is happening? There are men in suits at the Aspen House telling Dad he has 48 hours to vacate. They have a deed with your signature on a sale agreement. Do you understand me? You sold the family home." Then he pivoted to his own crisis, his voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "The bank froze the business credit lines. They're saying there's an investigation into the authorization of the primary holder. My clients are walking away, Elena. You've nuked my entire career." In the background, Elena could hear her mother wailing a sound of pure, selfish grief, and her father's low, rhythmic barking as he tried to command a situation that was no longer under his control. "I didn't sell the family home, Julian," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt more powerful than any shout. "I sold my house. The house grandmother left to me, the one you all used as a playground while you called me a charity case. And as for the credit lines, I simply informed the bank that I was no longer willing to guarantee loans I never agreed to in the first place. If your business can't survive without using your sister's name as a shield, then it was never a business to begin with." Julian let out a sound that was half sob, half growl, accusing her of being a monster, betraying the very blood that flowed through her veins. He told her she was ruining their lives over a few harmless jokes at a dinner party. Elena simply closed her eyes and remembered the smell of the lilies and the way the diamonds had flashed at her mother's throat. "It wasn't about the dinner, Julian," she said before hanging up. "It was about the fact that you all thought I would never be brave enough to read the fine print." The confrontation with her father happened 48 hours later. Arthur didn't call. He simply showed up at her apartment, his presence filling the small space like a dark cloud. He didn't look like the man who had commanded the ballroom at the Blackstone. He looked tired, his expensive coat damp from the sleet, and his eyes were narrowed with a cold, calculating intensity. He didn't ask to sit down. He stood in the center of her living room and looked around with a disdain that he didn't even bother to hide. "I suppose you think this is a grand victory, Elena," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You've embarrassed this family in front of the entire city. You've forced your mother into a hotel and cost Julian his reputation. I want you to call the bank and the buyers. I've already instructed our legal team to draft a rescission of the sale. We will tell them it was a mental health crisis, that you weren't in your right mind when you signed those papers. We can fix this, and we can move past it provided you do exactly what I say." Elena looked at him, realizing that even now, even after everything, he still saw her as a puppet to be manipulated. "I'm not calling anyone Dad," she replied, stepping toward him, until she could see the fine lines of age and anger on his face. And there was no mental health crisis. There was a clarity crisis, and it's over. "I met with Sarah, and I met with Lawrence Sterling, the man who handled Grandmother's estate. It turns out Lawrence was quite concerned about the way the Aspen property was being managed, and he was more than happy to provide the documentation showing how you and Mom bypassed the trust's original intent. If you try to tell anyone I wasn't in my right mind, Sarah will release the audit of the joint accounts Beatrice used for her personal spending. I don't think the board of your firm would appreciate knowing their managing partner's wife was using a daughter's social security number to hide millions in luxury debt." Arthur's jaw tightened, and for a moment Elena thought he might actually strike her. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the weight of 30 years of unspoken resentment and the sudden violent shift in power. "You would destroy your own father for a house," he hissed, his voice trembling with a rage he could no longer contain. "I didn't destroy you, Dad," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "I just stopped being the one to pay for your mistakes. You spent my entire life telling me I was a disappointment, that I was lucky to even be part of this family. But the truth is, this family was lucky I didn't read those papers 10 years ago. You didn't invite me to that dinner because you loved me. You invited me because you needed to feel superior to the person who was actually keeping you afloat." Arthur looked at her as if she were a stranger, a realization dawning on him that the daughter he thought he knew was gone, replaced by someone who was no longer afraid of his shadow. He left without another word, his footsteps heavy and slow as he descended the stairs, leaving Elena alone in the quiet of her reclamation. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal meetings and administrative tasks. Sarah was a force of nature, navigating the complexities of the bank closures and the finalization of the Aspen sale with a surgical precision. Every time Elena signed a new document, it was a choice she made for herself, a signature that belonged to her and her alone. She took a portion of the money from the sale and set up a proper trust for her own future one that no one else could touch. She rented a beautiful, light-filled studio in an old industrial building, a place where her game designs could grow and evolve in an environment of peace. She began to sleep through the night, the haunting whispers of her mother's voice finally fading into the background of her consciousness. She found that without the constant crushing weight of her family's expectations, she was capable of things she had never dreamed of. Her designs gained traction in the industry her vision recognized for its depth and emotional resonance. However, the final chapter of the family drama was yet to be written. Her mother Beatrice reached out one afternoon, asking to meet in a small, quiet park far from the prying eyes of their social circle. Elena agreed, not because she felt a sense of obligation, but because she wanted to see if there was any shred of the woman she had once called mother beneath the layers of artifice. They met on a park bench, the trees bare and skeletal against the grey sky. Beatrice looked diminished, the fire of her vanity replaced by a dull, flickering anxiety. She didn't lead with an insult or a command. She sat in silence for a long time, watching a group of children play on the nearby swings, before she spoke in a voice that was small and fragile. "They are talking about us, Elena," she said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "At the club, at the charity meetings. They know the house is gone. They know about the accounts. Your father is a shell of himself, and Julian is living in a small apartment downtown, trying to rebuild his book of business from nothing. I just don't understand how you could be so cold." Elena looked at her mother, feeling a strange, distant sense of pity that was entirely different from the version Beatrice had used at the dinner. "I wasn't cold, Mom. I was just done being invisible. You had every opportunity to see me as a daughter, but you chose to see me as an asset. You laughed when Julian called me a failure because it made you feel secure in your own position. But you were never secure. You were just living in a house I owned, wearing clothes I paid for with my future. Beatrice turned to her, her eyes wet with tears that felt for the first time genuine. "I didn't think you would ever find out," she whispered. "Arthur said it was the only way to keep the lifestyle going to make sure Julian had a head start. We thought we were protecting the family." Elena shook her head slowly. "You weren't protecting the family. You were protecting the illusion. And illusions always shatter when the light gets too bright." They sat in the cold for another hour, talking in a way they never had before. Beatrice admitted to the fears she had lived with the pressure to maintain a facade of perfection that had slowly eroded her own sense of self. Elena listened, but she didn't offer a return to the way things were. She made it clear that while she wouldn't leave them destitute, the days of her being their silent benefactor were over. She would provide a modest allowance for her mother, enough for a comfortable, quiet life, but it would come with a condition of total financial transparency and no further contact with the business dealings of Arthur or Julian. It was a boundary made of iron, and Beatrice, realizing she had no other choice, accepted it with a weary nod. It wasn't the reunion Beatrice might have hoped for, but it was a resolution that allowed Elena to breathe. As the months passed, the story of the family's fall from grace became a distant memory in the fast-paced world of Chicago's elite. New scandals replaced theirs, and the city moved on. Elena, however, remained changed. She found that the most important lesson she had learned wasn't about the law or money, but about the intrinsic value of one's own dignity. She realized that family is not a bond that justifies abuse, and that loyalty is a two-way street that must be paved with respect and honesty. She began to build a new family of her own, choosing a circle of friends and colleagues who valued her for her mind and her heart, not for what she could provide or how she could be used. She spent her summers traveling to the places she had always wanted to see, not as a guest of a family retreat, but as a woman discovering the world on her own terms. The studio she had rented became a sanctuary of creativity and a testament to her independence. She often worked late into the night, the city lights shimmering outside her window, feeling a sense of profound gratitude for the courage she had found on that New Year's Eve. She knew that the path she had taken was a difficult one, and that the scars of her upbringing would likely remain with her in some form forever. But she also knew that those scars were a reminder of her strength, a map of the journey she had taken from the shadows into the light. She had reclaimed her name, her credit, and her future, but more importantly, she had reclaimed her soul. The winter returned to Chicago, bringing with it the familiar howl of the wind and the scent of wood smoke in the air. Elena was invited to another gala, a charity event for the arts that she had supported through her design firm. She stood in the ballroom, the same hotel where her life had changed 1 year prior, but everything felt different. She was no longer sitting at the end of the table hoping to go unnoticed. She was standing in the center of the room talking to a group of young artists about the importance of protecting their intellectual property and standing up for their own worth. As she looked across the room, she saw a woman who reminded her of her mother, someone draped in diamonds and wearing a mask of brittle perfection, and she felt nothing but a quiet, steady sense of peace. She had learned that the fine print of life is where the truth resides, and that most people are too afraid to look for it. They would rather live in the comfort of a lie than face the terrifying, beautiful reality of their own responsibility. Elena had faced that reality, and she had come out on the other side with a clarity that was more precious than any inheritance. She understood now that true wealth wasn't measured in the size of a mountain estate or the balance of a bank account, but in the ability to look in the mirror and know that your life is entirely your own. She had taken back her name, and in doing so, she had written a story that was finally worth telling. As she walked home that night, the snow beginning to fall in soft, silent flakes, she thought about the dinner at the Blackstone and the words Beatrice had whispered. She realized that her mother had been right about one thing: she didn't belong at that table. But it wasn't because she was a failure or a disappointment. It was because she was meant for something much larger than their small, hollow world of appearances. She was meant for a life of substance, a life of integrity, and a life of her own making. The lesson was etched into her heart that the most loving thing you can do for yourself, and even for those who have hurt you, is to demand the truth and to walk away from anyone who requires you to be less than you are. The years would go on, and the memories of the family she once had would continue to soften around the edges, but the core of the lesson would remain. Elena would become a mentor to many, a voice for those who felt invisible in their own families, and a reminder that it is never too late to read the fine print. She had turned a night of humiliation into a lifetime of empowerment, and she had done it with the quiet, steady power of a woman who finally knew her own worth. The air was cold, the city was vast, and for the first time in her life, Elena was exactly where she was supposed to be. Her journey served as a profound reminder to everyone who knew her story. It taught that our identities are not collateral to be traded by those who claim to love us. It demonstrated that the courage to say no to a toxic legacy is the ultimate act of self-respect. And perhaps most importantly, it showed that even in the deepest winter of our lives, we have the power to plant the seeds of our own springtime. Elena's story didn't end with a grand reconciliation or a return to the gilded ballroom. It ended with a quiet studio, a clear conscience, and the boundless horizon of a future built on the solid ground of the truth. She was no longer a ghost in her own life. She was the architect of its every detail, and the masterpiece she was building was one of resilience, dignity, and grace. The humanistic lesson of her life became a beacon for others. True belonging is not something that is granted by birth or by blood, but something that is earned through the honesty of our actions and the strength of our boundaries. Elena had discovered that being part of a family shouldn't mean being a part of a crime, and that the greatest gift we can give to ourselves is the freedom to outgrow the roles that others have written for us. She stood as a testament to the fact that, while we cannot choose the families we are born into, we can always choose the person we become. And in that choice lies the true meaning of a life well lived. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in a soft white silence that seemed to wash away the remnants of the past. Elena reached her studio, the key turning smoothly in the lock, and stepped inside the warmth of her own creation. She sat at her desk, the light of the lamp illuminating her sketches and her plans, and she began to write. Not a legal document, not a trust agreement, but a new story, one where the heroine didn't need a mountain house or a family name to be whole. She just needed her own name, her own voice, and the courage to use them. And as she wrote, the ghosts of the Blackstone ballroom finally vanished, leaving behind nothing but the quiet, steady rhythm of a heart that was finally truly free.